"Don't let him fall asleep," the little black girl whispered, and every adult in the hospital lobby turned as if the rain itself had spoken. She stood just inside the sliding glass doors of Whitmore Children's Hospital, soaked from the storm, her sneakers squeaking against the polished floor, her thin arms hooked beneath the knees of a sick little boy on her back. He could not have been more than 6, his cheek resting against her shoulder, his eyes heavy, his breath small and uneven beneath the hood of a faded gray sweatshirt. The girl was 9, maybe 10, with dark brown skin, 2 neat braids hanging over the front of her wet jacket, and a torn green backpack bouncing against one hip. Her name was Nia Carter, though no one in that shining lobby knew it yet. To them, she was just a child who did not belong among the marble columns, soft blue lights, and quiet families waiting with insurance cards in their hands. Outside, November rain slapped the pavement in silver sheets. Inside, the air smelled like lemon cleaner, coffee, and money. The security guard near the entrance stepped forward with one palm raised, not rough, not cruel, but trained to stop anything that looked out of place. "Sweetheart, you can't come in like this," he said, glancing toward the boy on her back. "Where's your parent?" Nia adjusted her grip and swallowed hard. Her shoulders trembled from the weight, but her voice stayed clear. "My mom already tried." Nobody listened. A woman at the reception desk looked up, her polite smile fading into professional discomfort. A man in a navy suit paused near the elevators. A mother pulled her toddler a little closer. Nia saw all of it, every glance, every silent question, every person deciding what kind of story she was before she had finished telling it. But she did not cry. She only shifted the boy higher on her back and reached into the pocket of her jacket with 2 stiff fingers. The guard took another careful step. "Is he hurt?" "He's sick," Nia said. "His name is Caleb. He needs a doctor." The receptionist stood now, lowering her voice the way adults did when they wanted kindness to sound like a rule. "Do you have an appointment, honey?" Nia shook her head. "Insurance card?" Another shake. "A guardian with you?" Nia looked down at the floor for half a second, then lifted her chin. "My mom can't walk this far today." The lobby grew quieter. Somewhere behind the desk, a printer hummed. The boy on Nia's back made a soft sound, and her face changed instantly. Not fear. Focus. She turned her cheek toward him and whispered, "Stay with me, Caleb. You promised." That was the moment Richard Whitmore stepped out of the private elevator. 52 years old, white, tall, silver-haired, and dressed in a charcoal overcoat that probably cost more than Nia's family had spent on groceries in months. Richard had built Whitmore Medical Group into one of the most powerful hospital networks in the country. His name was etched into the wall behind the front desk in brushed steel letters, glowing under the lobby lights like a signature on the city itself. He had just left a meeting about a new luxury pediatric wing with garden suites, private chefs, and recovery rooms overlooking the Hudson River. He had been thinking about donors, construction timelines, and whether the press release should say compassion or innovation first. Then he saw the child. Not a statistic. Not a charity case. A little girl carrying a little boy through a storm as if her own spine were the only bridge left in the world. "What's happening here?" Richard asked. His voice was low, but the room knew it. The receptionist straightened. The guard stepped back. The man in the navy suit suddenly found interest in his phone. Nia turned toward Richard, taking him in quickly. The expensive coat, the polished shoes, the kind of face people obeyed. She did not beg. She did not soften herself. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket and held it out. Richard took it. The paper was damp, the ink blurred in places, but one sentence had been written in thick black marker across the center. "Don't let Caleb fall asleep." Richard felt something tighten beneath his ribs. "Who wrote this?" he asked. "My mom," Nia said. "She used to work here." The receptionist's expression flickered, just a small movement, but Richard saw it. He had made a fortune noticing the smallest movements in rooms full of powerful people. Now he noticed one around a child. "What's your mother's name?" he asked. Nia hesitated, not because she did not know the answer, but because she had learned that names could open doors or close them forever. Grace Carter. For a moment, the lobby seemed to lose all sound. Even the rain outside became distant. Richard looked from the paper to the boy, then back to Nia. Grace Carter. The name touched something old and buried in the back of his mind. A file, a complaint, a nurse who had disappeared from the system after an internal dispute years ago. He could not place the details, but he remembered enough to feel the first crack in his certainty. "Sir," the receptionist said softly, "without registration, we should probably direct them to county emergency services." Nia heard that. Her eyes moved to Richard's face, not pleading, not accusing, only waiting to see which kind of adult he would become. Caleb's fingers slipped from her shoulder, limp with exhaustion. Nia caught his hand immediately and pressed it against her chest. "Please," she said, and the word was small but not weak. "I carried him 8 blocks. I can carry him farther if I have to. But he needs help before I do." Richard stared at this child who had walked through cold rain with no ambulance, no appointment, no guarantee, and still spoke as if dignity were something no one could take from her unless she handed it over. He removed his overcoat and draped it carefully around both children, not touching them without permission, only shielding them from the lobby's bright chill. Then he turned to the stunned staff. "Get a wheelchair," he said. "Get Dr. Ellison from pediatric care. And unlock a room now." The receptionist blinked. "Mr. Whitmore, the protocol." Richard did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "A child is standing in my hospital carrying another child who can barely stay awake. That is the protocol." Nia watched him carefully, still unsure whether help could be trusted when it arrived wearing a rich man's coat. When the wheelchair rolled up, she did not step away immediately. She lowered Caleb into it with the slow care of someone placing a candle where the wind could not reach it. Richard knelt just enough to meet her eyes. "Nia," he said gently, because he had finally asked and she had finally told him, "I'm going to help your brother." Her wet braids clung to her cheeks. Her small hand stayed wrapped around the torn green backpack. "Don't just help him because you feel bad," she said. Richard went still. "Then why?" Nia looked past him at the glowing name on the wall, the name that owned the building, the doctors, the locked rooms, maybe even the silence that had followed her mother home. Then she looked back at him. "Help him because somebody here already knows the truth." The wheels of Caleb's chair rolled softly across the polished hospital floor, disappearing through a set of double doors as a pediatric team moved quickly but calmly around him. Nia stood frozen for the first time all day. Without her brother's weight on her back, her shoulders felt strangely empty, as if she had forgotten how to stand without carrying someone. Richard Whitmore noticed it immediately. He had spent years studying investors, politicians, and executives. He knew how people reacted under pressure, but this little girl was different. Most children would have collapsed into relief. Nia only tightened her grip on the worn green backpack and kept her eyes on the doors that had just closed behind Caleb. "They are going to take care of him," Richard said. Nia nodded once. That is what people said before. The answer landed harder than he expected. Around them, the lobby had slowly returned to life. Phones rang. Elevators chimed. Families moved through the building carrying flowers, coffee cups, and overnight bags. Yet Richard found himself unable to focus on anything except the child standing in front of him. "How long has your brother been sick?" he asked. Nia hesitated. "A while." "How long is a while?" Her eyes drifted toward the rain-covered windows. "Long enough that he stopped playing baseball in the park. Long enough that he gets tired climbing stairs. Long enough that my mom stopped pretending she was not scared." Richard felt a knot forming in his chest. The answers sounded practiced, as if she had repeated them silently to herself many times. A nurse approached and offered Nia a bottle of water. "Thank you," Nia said politely before taking it. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she slipped it into her backpack. Richard noticed that too. "You can drink it," he said. "I know." Nia glanced toward the treatment wing. "But Caleb might want it later." Richard looked away for a moment. Something about that simple decision unsettled him more than any dramatic story could have. The nurse smiled gently and left. Several feet away, 2 hospital administrators stood whispering to each other. Richard caught fragments. Registration, liability, policy, procedures, the familiar language of systems, the language he himself had helped build. Nia followed his gaze. "They do not like us being here." Richard turned back toward her. "Why would you say that?" She shrugged. "Because they keep looking at me instead of looking at Caleb." Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Rain streaked down the massive glass wall behind them, turning the city lights outside into blurry ribbons of gold and silver. Finally, Richard asked the question that had been bothering him since she arrived. What did you mean when you said somebody here already knows the truth? Nia's fingers tightened around one of the backpack straps. For the first time since he met her, uncertainty crossed her face. Not fear, more like caution. A child deciding whether an adult deserved the next piece of information. My mom told me not to talk about it. Then why bring it up? Because she also said that if nobody listened anymore, I should find somebody who still cared. Richard felt the words settle heavily inside him. And you think that somebody is me? Nia studied him carefully. I do not know yet. The honesty nearly made him smile. Before he could answer, a young doctor emerged from the treatment corridor. Mr. Whitmore? Richard stood immediately. Nia took one step forward. The doctor glanced down at her and softened his tone. Your brother is stable. His oxygen levels are improving, and we are running some tests. Nia released a breath she had been holding for hours. Her eyes closed briefly. Just briefly. Then she opened them again. Can I see him? In a little while. The doctor smiled. He asked for you. Nia nodded, swallowing hard. Okay. After the doctor left, Richard expected relief. Instead, Nia looked more troubled than before. What is wrong? He asked. She looked toward the hallway. Nothing. Nia. Her shoulders slumped slightly. If they figure out who my mom is, everything gets complicated. Richard felt a chill unrelated to the weather. Why? She opened the backpack and carefully removed an old photograph protected inside a plastic sleeve. The corners were bent. The image had faded with age. Richard accepted it. The photograph showed a younger woman in blue hospital scrubs standing beside a group of nurses. Everyone was smiling. Behind them hung a banner with the hospital logo. Whitmore Children's Hospital. Richard's eyes moved to the woman at the center. Grace Carter. Younger. Healthier. Proud. Then he noticed something else. The photograph had been folded many times. On the back, written in faded ink, were 6 words. We tried to do the right thing. Richard read the sentence twice. Then a third time. Something stirred in his memory. Not a full recollection. Just fragments. An internal review. 4 discussions. A complaint file that had vanished years ago among thousands of reports crossing executive desks. His pulse quickened. Where did you get this? Nia looked surprised by the question. My mom keeps it under her bed. Richard stared at the photo again. Somewhere inside his hospital, inside his company, inside a chapter of his life he barely remembered, a story had started years before this rainy afternoon. And somehow a little girl carrying her sick brother had just walked back into the middle of it. Richard remained motionless long after Nia lowered the photograph. The fluorescent lights above them hummed softly, and somewhere down the corridor a monitor beeped in a steady rhythm. Yet all he could hear were those 6 faded words written on the back of the picture. We tried to do the right thing. He turned the photograph over once more. Grace Carter's smile looked genuine, the kind worn by someone who believed her work mattered. He had seen thousands of employee photos throughout his career, but something about this one refused to leave his thoughts. What happened to your mom? He asked quietly. Nia carefully took the photograph back and slipped it into the plastic sleeve. She stopped talking about the hospital. Why? Nia shrugged. At first she talked about it every day. Then one day she stopped completely. Richard studied her face. People do not usually stop talking about something they loved unless something painful happened. Nia looked toward the hallway where Caleb was being treated. That is what I think too. A silence settled between them. It was not uncomfortable. It felt more like 2 people standing at the edge of a story neither fully understood. A few minutes later a nurse approached. You can see your brother now. Nia's eyes brightened instantly. For the first time since arriving, she looked like a 9-year-old girl instead of someone carrying the weight of an entire family. She followed the nurse down the corridor, then stopped and looked back at Richard. Are you coming? The question surprised him. Do you want me to? Nia considered it for a second. You listened. Then she continued walking. Richard followed. Caleb's room sat near the end of a quiet hallway overlooking the rainy city. The little boy rested comfortably in bed beneath a light blue blanket. His color looked better. His breathing sounded easier. When he spotted Nia, a small smile appeared on his face. You stayed. Of course I stayed, Nia said, moving beside him. I told you I would. Caleb glanced toward Richard. Who is that? Nia lowered her voice dramatically. A very important man. Caleb's eyes widened. Like the mayor? More important than the mayor, Nia whispered. Richard laughed softly despite himself. Caleb looked impressed. Wow. For a moment the room felt unexpectedly warm. The storm outside faded into the background. Nia pulled the bottle of water from her backpack and handed it to Caleb. He accepted it with both hands. Richard remembered how she had saved it earlier. Not because she was told to, because she was thinking about her brother before herself. Again, the door opened, and Dr. Ellison entered carrying a tablet. "Good news," he said. "The initial tests are encouraging." Nia immediately sat up straighter. "What does encouraging mean?" The doctor smiled. "It means your brother is responding well to treatment. We still need more answers, but right now he is doing better than when he arrived." Relief washed across Nia's face. She closed her eyes for a second and whispered a quiet thank you. Richard noticed that she was not thanking the doctor. She was thanking something bigger. Hope. After the doctor left, Richard stepped into the hallway to make several calls. Within minutes, senior administrators began arriving. Their expressions ranged from concerned to nervous. Richard held up the photograph. "I want every personnel file connected to Grace Carter." One administrator frowned slightly. "That case is very old." Richard looked at him. "Then you should have plenty of time to find it." The man quickly nodded. Another executive shifted uneasily. "There may be legal restrictions on accessing archived records." Richard's voice remained calm. "I own the archive." Nobody argued after that. An hour later, Richard sat alone in a conference room reviewing digital records on a large screen. Most files loaded instantly. Annual reviews, training certifications, scheduling documents. Then he searched Grace Carter. The screen paused. A message appeared. "Access restricted." Richard stared at it. He entered higher credentials. The message remained unchanged. "Access restricted." A strange feeling settled over him. He had spent decades building systems. Systems did not hide information without a reason. Someone had intentionally buried this file. His assistant entered carrying coffee. "Sir." Richard pointed toward the screen. "Who authorized this restriction?" She looked surprised. "I have never seen a personnel file locked at that level." Richard leaned back slowly. Outside the conference room windows, rain continued sliding down the glass. Far below, headlights moved through the city like streams of light. Somewhere upstairs, a little boy was recovering. Somewhere in a small apartment, a woman named Grace Carter had spent years carrying a secret. And now, for the first time, Richard was beginning to suspect that the problem was never Caleb's illness. The problem was whatever somebody had worked very hard to keep hidden. Back in Caleb's room, Nia sat beside her brother watching the rain. Caleb looked sleepy but comfortable. "Do you think that rich guy is really helping us?" he asked. Nia thought carefully before answering. She looked toward the hallway where Richard had disappeared. "I do not know yet." Caleb yawned. "You always know things." Nia smiled faintly and pulled the blanket higher around him. "Not always." Then she looked through the window at the glowing skyline and remembered the way Richard had reacted when he saw the photograph. It was not the reaction of a man pretending to care. It was the reaction of someone who had just recognized a piece of his own past. And for the first time since carrying Caleb through the rain, Nia allowed herself to wonder if coming to this hospital had not been a mistake after all. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale gray clouds that hovered over Manhattan like unfinished thoughts. Richard Whitmore had slept less than 3 hours. The locked personnel file remained open on the screen in his office, the words "access restricted" glowing against the darkness long after midnight. He had reviewed financial reports, legal summaries, and internal audits worth billions of dollars without feeling what he felt now. Curiosity had become concern. Concern was slowly turning into responsibility. At 7:15 in the morning, he entered the pediatric floor carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate from the hospital cafe. He was surprised to find Nia already awake. She sat beside Caleb's bed with a notebook balanced on her knees. Her brother was still asleep, breathing steadily beneath the blanket. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of rain tapping against the window. "You are here early," Richard said. Nia looked up. "You are too." He handed her one of the cups. She accepted it carefully. "Thank you." For a moment, neither spoke. Then Richard noticed the notebook. Several pages were filled with neat handwriting. Names, dates, notes. "What is that?" he asked. Nia hesitated before closing the notebook. "Just things." Richard sat down in the chair across from her. "Things about your brother?" Nia shook her head. "Things my mom told me not to forget." Something about the answer made Richard pay closer attention. "What kind of things?" Nia stared at the notebook cover. "People." Richard waited. Eventually, she opened the notebook again. The first page contained a list of names. Some had addresses. Others had phone numbers. A few had small notes beside them. Single mom. Child with asthma. Could not pay. Turned away. Richard felt his stomach tighten. He looked at another page. Elderly grandfather raising twins. Needed treatment. Lost insurance. Another page. Family moved away after denial. Another page. Child missed specialist appointment. What is this? He asked quietly. Nia's voice dropped almost to a whisper. My mom started writing them down years ago. Richard looked up. Why? Because she said people disappear when nobody remembers their names. The room seemed smaller suddenly. Richard stared at the notebook again. It was not a diary. It was a record. A record kept by a woman who had refused to forget. Before he could ask another question, a gentle knock sounded at the door. Dr. Ellison entered carrying fresh test results. Good morning. Nia immediately stood. How is Caleb? The doctor smiled. Better. Relief flashed across her face. The treatment is working? Yes. The doctor glanced at Richard before continuing. There are still questions we need to answer, but we are seeing positive improvement. Caleb stirred slightly, blinking awake. When he noticed Richard, he smiled. The important guy came back. Richard laughed softly. I guess I did. Caleb pointed toward the window. Do rich people ever get sick? The question caught everyone off guard. Richard considered it seriously. Yes. Rich people get sick. Rich people get scared. Rich people make mistakes. Caleb thought about that. Then why do people act like money fixes everything? Richard had no answer. Nia looked at her brother and smiled faintly. Because people like easy answers. Later that afternoon, Richard finally received a call from the hospital archives department. A nervous voice came through the speaker. Mr. Whitmore, we located additional information regarding Grace Carter. Richard immediately stood, and a brief pause followed. The restrictions on her file were not placed by Human Resources. Richard frowned. Who placed them? Another pause. Longer this time. According to the system records, the authorization came directly from the executive board. Silence filled the office. Richard slowly lowered himself back into his chair. When, approximately 8 years ago, 8 years, Richard stared out the window toward the city skyline. 8 years earlier, he had been expanding the company into 3 new states. He remembered mergers, construction projects, investor meetings. He remembered growth. He did not remember Grace Carter. Yet somehow the board had considered her important enough to lock away. Send me everything, he said. Immediately. After the call ended, Richard remained motionless. Across town, hidden inside a modest apartment, a woman had spent 8 years carrying a burden. Inside the hospital, her daughter carried a notebook filled with names nobody else remembered. And somewhere between those two truths was a secret powerful enough to make an entire executive board bury a file. For the first time, Richard stopped asking whether Grace Carter's story mattered. The real question now was why so many people had worked so hard to make sure nobody ever heard it. By late afternoon, the rain had finally weakened into a mist that drifted across the city like a thin gray veil. Caleb was resting comfortably, and for the first time since arriving at the hospital, Nia allowed herself to leave his bedside for more than a few minutes. She stood near the window of the family lounge watching traffic crawl through the streets below when Richard approached carrying a folder tucked beneath one arm. His expression was thoughtful, heavier than before. Nia, he said gently. She turned. Did you find something? Richard glanced toward the folder. Maybe, but I think I need to understand your mother before I understand the paperwork. Nia lowered her eyes. My mom does not like strangers. I can understand that. She studied him for a moment, then surprised herself by asking, do you want to meet her? Richard had expected resistance. Instead, he found a door opening. If she is willing. Nia looked toward Caleb's room. He is sleeping. We could go now. Less than an hour later, a black sedan rolled through a quieter part of the city where old brick apartment buildings stood shoulder to shoulder beneath cloudy skies. Richard sat in the back seat beside Nia, who held her green backpack across her lap. She pointed toward a narrow building with faded paint and flower boxes beneath a few windows. That is ours. Richard stepped onto the sidewalk and looked up. The building was modest but cared for. The front steps had been swept clean despite the weather. Someone had planted small yellow flowers near the entrance. Small signs of pride existed everywhere if people bothered to notice them. Nia unlocked the front door and led him up 2 flights of stairs. When she opened the apartment door, the smell of soup and laundry detergent drifted into the hallway. The apartment itself was tiny but organized. Books lined one shelf. Children's drawings decorated a wall. Everything had a place. Nothing was wasted. A woman sitting near the window slowly looked up from a blanket draped across her knees. Her eyes widened immediately. Nia? Then she saw Richard standing behind her daughter. The warmth in her face vanished. Not anger. Recognition. Grace Carter knew exactly who he was. Silence filled the room. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Finally, Grace stood. Nia, would you give us a minute? Nia looked from one adult to the other. Mom, it is all right. Reluctantly, Nia disappeared into the small bedroom down the hall. Grace remained standing. Richard noticed how tired she looked, but he also noticed something stronger. Dignity. The same quality he had seen in Nia. I did not expect to see you again, Grace said quietly. Richard nodded. The truth is, I do not think we ever really met. A faint smile crossed her face. That depends on what you mean by met. Richard glanced around the apartment. On a nearby table sat framed photographs of Nia and Caleb. Through the years, school certificates, report cards, evidence of a mother who had fought hard to keep life normal. Your daughter brought your son to the hospital. Grace closed her eyes briefly. I know. He is improving. Relief flashed across her face before she could hide it. Thank God. Richard took a careful breath. Grace, why was your file sealed? The question hung between them. Grace slowly sat back down. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then she looked toward the hallway where Nia had disappeared. Because some people thought forgetting would be easier than fixing what was wrong. Richard felt the weight of the answer immediately. Wrong how? Grace laughed softly, though there was no humor in it. You really do not remember, do you? Richard did not respond. He could not. Grace studied him for a long moment before speaking again. Years ago, I believed hospitals existed for patients. I believed if something unfair happened, reporting it would make things better. She looked down at her hands. I was naive. Richard pulled a chair closer. What happened? Grace reached toward a drawer beside the window and removed a thick manila envelope. The edges were worn from age. She held it for a second before placing it on the table between them. Everything started with a meeting. Richard stared at the envelope. What is in there? Grace's eyes met his. Calm. Certain. Unafraid. The reason somebody locked my file. Outside, the clouds shifted slightly, allowing a narrow beam of evening sunlight to slip through the rain. It touched the old envelope resting between them, like a spotlight waiting for a story that had remained hidden far too long. Richard looked at the envelope, but did not touch it immediately. The room felt unusually quiet, as if even the city beyond the window had paused to listen. Grace rested her hands in her lap and watched him carefully. Years had passed since she had last spoken about what happened, yet the memories seemed close enough to reach out and touch. Finally, Richard opened the envelope. Inside were neatly organized documents, meeting notes, copies of emails, and several handwritten pages. The first page carried a date from 8 years earlier. Beneath it was a list of patient cases. Richard scanned the names and paused. Many of them looked familiar, not because he knew the people, but because he had seen similar numbers in reports. Numbers, percentages, budget summaries. Grace noticed the change in his expression. That was the problem, she said quietly. People became numbers. Richard continued reading. The documents described meetings where certain families had struggled to qualify for treatment programs after policy changes. The language was polite, professional, and carefully written, but beneath the words he could see the pattern. Access delayed. Coverage denied. Applications postponed. Cases closed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing illegal on the surface. Yet together they formed something troubling. You brought this forward? He asked. Grace nodded. Several of us did. Richard looked up. Several. Grace reached into the envelope and pulled out a photograph. 5 hospital employees stood together in a break room. Younger faces. Hopeful faces. We believed if leadership saw what was happening, it would be corrected. Richard stared at the image. And what happened? Grace smiled sadly. The meeting ended. The reports disappeared. Most people moved on. Richard lowered his eyes. But you did not. No. For a moment neither spoke. Then Grace pointed toward one particular document. Read the names. Richard did. Slowly. Several matched names he had seen written in Nia's notebook. He looked up sharply. Grace nodded. That notebook started here. Richard felt a chill. You kept track of them all these years? As many as I could. Her voice remained calm. Someone had to remember. From the hallway came the sound of a door opening. Nia appeared carrying 2 mugs of tea. She stopped when she noticed the documents spread across the table. Grace gave her a small smile. It is all right. Nia placed the mugs down and sat beside her mother. Richard watched the interaction carefully. The trust between them was obvious. So was the burden they shared. Did your mom ever tell you about these papers? Richard asked. Nia nodded. Not all of it. Just enough. Enough for what? Nia looked down. At her hands. Enough so that if something happened to her, somebody else would know. The answer landed heavily. Grace immediately reached over and squeezed her daughter's hand. Nothing is happening to me. Nia smiled. I know. Yet Richard could tell this family had lived with uncertainty for years. Not fear. Uncertainty. The kind that comes from being ignored too many times. He closed the folder and leaned back. Grace, why did you never come forward publicly? Grace laughed softly. Who would have listened? Richard opened his mouth to answer, then stopped. He knew exactly what she meant. 8 years ago, she had been a nurse. A single mother. An employee challenging a system much larger than herself. The odds had never been fair. Rainwater slid slowly down the apartment window. Evening shadows stretched across the room. Richard looked around again. The books. The drawings. The carefully repaired furniture. Everything told the same story. This family had lost opportunities, but they had not lost themselves. His gaze settled on Nia's green backpack resting beside the couch. The zipper hung slightly open. Inside he could see notebooks, pencils, and folded papers. Not toys. Not distractions. Records. Responsibilities. Things a child should never have needed to carry. Yet she had carried them anyway. Just as she had carried Caleb through the rain. Richard stood slowly. Grace looked at him. What are you thinking? For the first time that evening, his answer came without hesitation. I am thinking somebody spent 8 years hiding a problem instead of fixing it. Grace remained silent. Richard continued. And I am thinking that ends now. Nia studied his face carefully, searching for signs that this was another promise that would disappear once the conversation ended. She found none. Outside, the clouds finally began to break apart. A narrow band of golden sunlight appeared along the horizon, reflecting across the windows of the neighboring buildings. The room brightened slightly. Grace followed the light with her eyes before looking back at Richard. If you are serious, she said quietly, the truth is bigger than these papers. Richard nodded. Then show me the rest. Grace reached beneath the table and pulled out a second box. Larger, heavier, filled with years of letters, notes, and records. Richard stared at it in silence. Whatever story had begun 8 years ago was far from over. In fact, he was only beginning to understand how many lives had been waiting for someone to finally listen. The next 3 days moved like a slow river carrying old secrets toward daylight. Richard personally reviewed every document from Grace's boxes. Each morning before sunrise, he sat in his office surrounded by stacks of records, reading names that had been forgotten by everyone except one determined mother and one determined daughter. The deeper he looked, the more a pattern emerged. Families who struggled financially had encountered delays, confusing requirements, and barriers that were never technically violations but often became impossible obstacles. None of the documents revealed cruelty. The truth was far more unsettling. The system had simply become so focused on efficiency that it stopped seeing people. On the 4th morning, Richard stood before a wall-sized screen in a private conference room. Several senior executives sat around the table. Coffee cups steamed quietly. Laptops glowed beneath fluorescent lights. Richard placed one thin notebook in the center of the table. Nia's notebook. What is this? One executive asked. Richard looked around the room. A record of the people we forgot. Nobody spoke. He opened the notebook and began reading names. One after another. A child. A grandmother. A single father. A family that moved away. A teenager who lost access to specialized care. The room grew quieter with every page. Finally, one board member shifted uncomfortably. Richard, these situations are unfortunate, but many of these policies existed before any of us were involved. Richard closed the notebook. That is exactly the problem. His voice remained calm. Everyone assumed responsibility belonged to somebody else. Across town, Nia sat beside Caleb's hospital bed helping him with school assignments. Color had returned to his face. His smile appeared more often now. He was even arguing about math problems again, which Nia considered an encouraging sign. Caleb set down his pencil. Do you think Mom is worried? Nia smiled. Mom is always worried. Caleb thought about that. Do you think the important guy is still helping? Nia looked out the window. The rain had disappeared. Bright autumn sunlight reflected from nearby buildings. Yes, she said quietly. I think he is. Later that afternoon, Richard arrived carrying a small cardboard box. Caleb immediately sat up. Is that for me? Richard laughed. Partly. Inside were several books, puzzles, and a model airplane kit. Caleb's eyes widened. This is awesome. Richard handed another item to Nia. It was a brand new notebook with a dark blue cover. She stared at it without speaking. Your old one is almost full, Richard said. Nia ran her fingers across the cover. Thank you. Then she surprised him. But I am keeping the old one. Richard nodded. I would not expect anything else. For a moment, all three sat together in comfortable silence. Sunlight spilled across the room. Somewhere down the hall, a nurse laughed. The hospital felt different now. Warmer. More human. Yet beneath the calm surface, larger changes were beginning. That evening, Richard received a call from an independent auditor he had quietly hired. The findings confirmed much of what Grace's record suggested. The problem was not one person. It was a culture of distance. Decisions had become detached from consequences. Reports had become statistics. Families had become case numbers. Richard stood by his office window long after the call ended. The city stretched endlessly beneath him. Thousands of lights glowed against the darkening sky. 8 years ago, he had measured success in expansion charts and quarterly growth. Now a little girl carrying her brother through the rain had forced him to measure success differently. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His assistant entered. There is something else you should see. She handed him a sealed envelope that had arrived from the archives department. No return address. No explanation. Richard opened it carefully. Inside was a single page. At the top appeared the minutes from a private executive meeting held 8 years earlier. Halfway down the page, one sentence had been highlighted in yellow. Recommendation: suppress further discussion to avoid reputational risk. Richard read the line twice. Then a third time. Slowly he lowered the paper. For years he had assumed the truth had been lost. Now he realized something far more troubling. The truth had not disappeared at all. Someone had made a deliberate choice to bury it. And for the first time since this journey began, Richard understood that fixing the future would require confronting the past in full daylight. The following morning dawned bright and unusually clear. Sunlight poured through the hospital windows, painting long golden rectangles across the floor where nurses moved quietly between rooms. For the first time in days, Caleb asked if he could walk down the hallway instead of using a wheelchair. The doctors agreed, and Nia stayed beside him every step of the way. She watched carefully, ready to help if he became tired, but Caleb surprised everyone. He made it all the way to the family lounge with a grin on his face. See, he announced proudly. I told you I am getting stronger. Nia laughed. Do not get too confident. Caleb pointed toward the snack machine. That sounds like something Mom would say. At nearly the same moment, several floors above them, Richard entered the largest conference room in the building. The atmosphere felt different from previous meetings. No casual conversation. No polite smiles. Copies of documents sat at every seat. The highlighted board minutes rested at the center of the table. One by one the directors arrived. Some appeared nervous. Others looked annoyed. Richard waited until everyone was seated before speaking. 8 years ago, a decision was made in this company. He held up the document. Somebody decided that protecting reputation mattered more than addressing legitimate concerns. Silence followed. Several people avoided eye contact. Finally, an older board member cleared his throat. Richard, those circumstances were complicated. Richard looked directly at him. Children needing medical care should never be complicated. Nobody responded. The truth was beginning to fill spaces where excuses once lived. Hours later, Richard left the meeting carrying more answers than he expected. Several former executives had approved internal recommendations designed to bury criticism instead of solving problems. Technically, everything had been framed as risk management. In reality, it had silenced voices like Grace Carter's. As he walked through the hospital lobby, he found himself thinking less about documents and more about people. About Grace keeping records for 8 years. About Caleb sleeping in a hospital bed. About Nia carrying responsibility that should never have belonged to a child. When he reached the pediatric floor, he discovered Nia sitting alone near the window. The new blue notebook rested in her lap. She was writing something carefully. "What are you working on?" Richard asked. Nia closed the notebook halfway. "Adding names." Richard sat beside her. "More names?" She nodded. "Some people called after hearing Caleb was here. People your mother helped. Some of them." She looked out at the skyline. "Others just wanted someone to listen." Richard felt a familiar ache in his chest. "And you listened?" Nia shrugged. "Mom says people can survive a lot of things if they know somebody remembers them." Richard remained quiet for a moment. Then he asked the question that had been forming for days. "Nia, after everything that happened, why did you still come to this hospital?" She smiled faintly. "Because Caleb needed help." "You were not afraid?" Nia considered the question carefully. "I was afraid nobody would care." The honesty struck him harder than any accusation could have. Before he could answer, Grace appeared at the end of the hallway. She looked healthier than when he first met her. Not because her problems had disappeared, but because some of the weight she carried was finally being shared. She approached slowly and handed Richard a folded letter. "I found this in the second box," she said. Richard opened it. The paper was old. The handwriting belonged to Grace. It was a draft resignation letter she had written years earlier, but never sent. Halfway down the page, one sentence stood out. "I still believe hospitals should see people before numbers." Richard read the line twice. Then he looked up at Grace. She smiled sadly. "I kept waiting for someone higher up to believe it too." Through the large windows behind them, sunlight flooded the city. The storm that had brought Nia and Caleb to the hospital felt impossibly far away now. Yet Richard knew the journey was not finished. The records were being reviewed. Independent auditors were preparing reports. Conversations that had been buried for years were finally happening in daylight. Most importantly, people were listening. As Caleb waved excitedly from the other end of the hallway, and Nia hurried to join him, Richard watched the two children laugh together. He realized something then. The biggest truth hidden inside all those documents was not about policies, meetings, or reputations. It was about a little girl who refused to stop carrying others when the world made it easier to look away. And because she refused to look away, neither could he. 2 weeks later, the main atrium of Whitmore Children's Hospital looked very different from the day Nia had carried Caleb through its doors. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass ceiling, filling the vast space with warm gold instead of cold gray. Families moved through the lobby, nurses greeted patients by name, and a quiet sense of anticipation hung in the air. Reporters stood near the back. Hospital employees filled rows of chairs. Doctors, administrators, and board members sat together beneath a large screen displaying a simple message. Every name matters. Nia sat beside Caleb in the front row. Caleb no longer looked tired. Color had returned to his face. His shoulders were stronger, and his smile appeared every few minutes. Grace sat beside them, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Richard stood behind a podium at the center of the room. For a moment, he simply looked at the crowd. Then he began. For years, this institution measured success through numbers, growth, revenue, expansion. We celebrated what we built, but we failed to ask an important question. Who did we leave behind? The room fell silent. Richard continued. He spoke about the investigation. He spoke about policies that had placed distance between decision makers and families. He spoke about concerns that had been ignored instead of addressed. Most importantly, he accepted responsibility. Not because he had personally created every problem, but because leadership meant owning the truth once it was revealed. Several people lowered their eyes. Others nodded slowly. No one argued. The facts had become impossible to deny. Then Richard did something nobody expected. He stepped away from the podium and walked directly toward Grace Carter. The entire room watched. Grace looked surprised as he stopped beside her chair. 8 years ago, he said, his voice carrying through the atrium, you tried to do the right thing. You spoke up because you believed patients deserved better. You were right. Grace blinked rapidly. Tears gathered in her eyes, but she remained composed. Richard handed her a framed certificate. The words across the top read Restored Service and Leadership Recognition. Beneath them appeared her name, Grace Carter. The crowd rose into applause. Not loud, not theatrical, genuine. Grace looked down at the certificate and then back at Richard. Thank you, she whispered. Richard shook his head. No, Thank you for refusing to forget. The applause continued. Yet Richard was not finished. He turned toward the screen behind him. A new image appeared. It showed a photograph of a worn green backpack resting on a hospital chair. Several people exchanged puzzled glances. Nia immediately recognized it. Richard smiled. There is one more person I need to recognize. Nia froze. Caleb grinned instantly. Oh, he whispered. Laughter rippled through the front rows. Richard motioned for Nia to join him. Slowly she stood and walked to the stage. Hundreds of eyes followed her. Yet she carried herself exactly the same way she had carried Caleb through the rain. Calm, steady, unafraid. Richard knelt slightly, so they stood closer to eye level. Most people would have seen a little girl carrying her brother. He paused. I saw someone carrying far more than that. The image on the screen changed. Names appeared, dozens of them, then hundreds. Names collected in notebooks. Names remembered, when others forgot. A soft murmur moved through the audience. Richard looked at Nia. You carried stories. You carried responsibility. You carried hope for people who thought nobody was listening anymore. Nia looked down for a second, then back up. Richard handed her a small plaque. It read the Nia Carter Family Advocacy Fund, established to ensure every child receives a voice before becoming a number. Gasps spread through the room. Nia stared at the plaque. You named it after me? Richard smiled. Because you reminded all of us what we were supposed to be. For a moment, she seemed unable to speak. Then she asked the same question she had carried in her heart since that rainy afternoon. Why did you help us? The room grew quiet again. Richard considered the answer carefully. Finally, he looked toward Caleb, toward Grace, toward the crowd, and then back at Nia. Because you showed me the difference between managing a system and caring for people. Nia nodded slowly. Then she surprised everyone with her own answer. You did not save my brother because you were rich. Richard listened. You saved him because you finally listened. The silence that followed felt deeper than applause. Then the entire atrium rose to its feet. Doctors, nurses, families, executives, everyone. Sunlight poured through the glass ceiling above them, illuminating faces that seemed lighter than before. Later, as the event ended and people slowly drifted away, Nia stood near the window overlooking the city. Her old green backpack rested against her shoulder. Caleb stood beside her eating a cookie far too quickly. Grace laughed and told him to slow down. Richard joined them quietly. Together they watched the sunlight reflect across the skyline. What happens now? Caleb asked. Richard smiled. Now we keep listening. Outside, the city moved forward as it always had. Cars crossed bridges. People hurried down sidewalks. Life continued. Yet inside one hospital, because a little girl refused to put her brother down and refused to let forgotten names disappear, an entire system had finally remembered what mattered most.